is the most impressive group of cosplayers I have ever seen, because that looks so much like Brian Froud.
It's like
he's taller in real life.
First prize. So yeah, welcome everybody. Our first Q&A panel of the day, the creation of Thra, starting at the beginning. Of course, I think the thing that's probably hit all of us that are as fans is just the magnitude and the importance of the event, actually, and the chance for you all to be together again. So I think some quick words from each of you on your feelings of being here today would be lovely, actually, to get started. Tim, you want to?
Oh, you want me to start?
Yeah.
Well, John and Val, I haven't seen since the last day of shooting on set in, I think, July of '82, or thereabouts. And a lot of the people that are here I haven't seen since then. So, Facebook and all those other things didn't exist back then. So we had no way of keeping in touch. So for us, it's like really incredible to be together again.
Yeah, I know. I feel the same way. It's amazing after 40 years to be getting back together with people. And then once we were together and talking last night, it didn't seem like any time had passed at all, really. And there we were, back again, reliving those glory days.
Oh, Lord, I kept changing my address. So they couldn't find me, but they tracked me down.
We got you in the end, Brian.
Well, I could find you.
How could you tell that was me hiding under the bed?
All those years, it was amazing.
Right. It's absolutely fascinating, because when I fetched up into New York when we started this whole film, there were about, 9 of us, was there, I think, originally, and 6 of us. And then when we eventually made the film, we had, I think then it was, I always remember the figure because it was a number of days in the year, 365 people made The Dark Crystal. The Netflix one, I don't know how many, it's in the 1,000 or something now, isn't it? But it is, but we made the film originally, the film that we wanted to see ourselves. That was the secret of it, really. But it's been fascinating over the years of how many have become part of the film. It's been you lot over the years who have championed it, loved it, been involved with it in one way or another. And suddenly, that's why when we worked together with Jim Henson, the thing it felt like was family. It was always family, wasn't it? I mean, so there's been it's been hard for many people and a heartbreak for many people, because we started in New York and then we moved to London. We brought some people over, but a lot of people we had to leave behind. There was always the people we left behind. However, it's been extraordinary when we were making the Netflix thing, the number of people that came from the old days would just come and visit and be part of it again. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Valerie?
Hi. I watched Dark Crystal a couple of nights ago for the first time in ages and ages. It was completely magical and I absolutely loved it. And the work that went into it, the number of, wonderful, brilliant people who worked on that film, and not, all instigated by Brian's fabulous designs. I'm in awe of it even now. I think it was the most wonderful thing to work on. And also working with Jim and Frank, they were such lovely people. They would come round every day and see how we were doing and, have a chat and keep in touch with everything. It was very, very intimate and very personal. And the wonderful thing was at Elstree was that Jim took over a whole studio and turned it into a workshop where the performers had their own performance space at the end of the workshop. So if we needed to fit anybody with anything, they were always on hand. And it was such a... So everybody worked together. We were next to the Gartham. The Landstriders were next to the Gartham. And was it Fred who made the Gartham? He became quite competitive because, you know, we were sort of going to be in battle together. But we were right next to them. And it was really the most fabulous experience. And I never, in my wildest dreams, thought that 30, 40 years later, so many people would have been affected by it. But yes, no, a fabulous experience, and I'm very, very happy to see you all here and having appreciated it so much. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Valerie. If you kindly pass the mic to John, and John, share your thoughts with us.
Well, pretty much everything they said, I think. No, but as Brian said, it was like a family. This film, Dark Crystal, started so many people off in the British film industry. And it was a very lucky sort of frontier time. So the whole issue of puppets and live action, we used to upset special effects because we actually got to talk to the director. Because some of our creations had lines and actually had to speak and say things and do things and hit people as well. But it started a whole new genre of filmmaking. But yes, anyway, it's good to see you.
Cool. Lovely. Thank you, John. Keep hold of that for me. Brian, then, I think as fans as we are, quite aware of the story now of how Jim kind of found your artwork and came over to see you and was inspired by the landscape around your home. The Mystics are also based on your troll fantasy artwork as well. Was there any kind of unfamiliar artistic territory that the Dark Crystal kind of pulled you into? Any kind of creatures or what methods that you kind of thought, oh, hang on a minute, I don't really know where this is going?
Actually, well, everything, really. I love the Muppets, and because actually there was one stage, and we won't talk to this wrong, that John and I lived together, and I remember we watched the Muppets there, and I always ended up on the floor because it was so funny. I would slide off the chair. So when the man from the
married at the time.
Yeah, right. No, we were sharing and so to have Mr. Muppet phone you up and have a meeting with me, and I could hear him saying, could you come to America and design this thing? And I thought, oh my God, what the hell am I going to do? And so there was nothing there except that he loved my trolls, and so that was like the beginning of it. But I could never get a deal with them, so they were going to own everything, and I said to Jim, but these trolls are mine, I'm not going to give them away. So the big secret of the way the Mystics look like the Mystics is that I gave them 4 arms, and that's just a copyright issue. So he owns 4-arm trolls and I own 2-arm trolls. And so the next step...
We had to make it work.
Yeah, which is absolute nightmare. I mean... but I remember on the Netflix series is that the trolls came in, the Mystics came in very late in the game, in the series, but there was a moment where the night before they were coming on set, we had everybody gathered together to manipulate the 4 arms. And even though when you're standing there in front of them and you know how it's manipulated, and this is the magic of what we did and with Jim Henson, to make these creatures, which are puppets, to see them come to life. And it's absolute magic. And you just saw that when the 4 arms start weaving, literally their magic, it's amazing. And so what was wonderful to work with Jim is what we're saying is that we worked hard about how to do this, and we were just looking at a photograph now, which I'd never seen, of where the people are huddled together, just trying to create the shapes to figure out how we were going to do it. And so, what Jim brought to it was the space. I mean, he gave us like emotional space and the time to develop that. And meanwhile, he's saying, but there's a whole world here, Brian. And so, it's step by step. So I started by trying to imagine for them the the Skeksis. So there's some early sketches, and then a bit like fish, and then they became more bird-like, mainly because the trolls, we can't keep them trolls, but I mean, were the fixed thing. So we knew that in terms of their underpinning, their dynamics, they were the opposite of the Skeksis. So suddenly the Skeksis started to form it with their shapes because they were the opposite. And then Jim really loved England. He loved the mysticism of the place, and so he was absolutely open to anything we put in. I mean, I never really talked to him about it too much, but I snuck in all this like geometry and ley lines and various things. And so once I did that, everything I designed had those underpinning of patterns, and suddenly the whole world. And then John had to sort of deal with that. There was nothing that just had like simple things like a couple of legs and a couple of wings. They all had like 6 wings and 5 legs or whatever. So everybody had to work out. It pushed their boundaries. But once, so the trick of what we did was not me making everybody look like what I drew, was to get them to understand the language. So once they understood the language, we wanted them to run with it. We wanted them to contribute to the way that the world looked. And everybody did. And that's why it has this wonderful, dynamic, cohesive whole to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's quite a good follow-on, actually, because Brian's work is very fantastical. How did you go about creating the anatomy of Thra when you were bringing together its wildlife and its plant life? How did you infuse the motion into it?
Well, Brian had done us a sort of notebook, sketchbook, so we had a lot of simple, I say simple, they're Brian's drawings, but ideas, sketches in a book. So we'd come up with weird stuff, see if we could make it work, and then we'd flip through the book and find something that looked like it. But obviously that was inspired by Brian's vision, by his way of looking at things. So, incidentally, I think Jim died at 53, because we figured he was probably about 120. Because I can remember him operating the main puppet. Just I'd wandered in on the set, and there's 3 or 4 people around him. So he's playing the main character, he's directing the scene, and I think he had a video linked to the second unit on another stage. So, that guy burned very, very brightly.
Many of you don't realize that this man can create more characters in like 10 minutes than anybody I've ever met. There's like, sometimes when people ask me to design stuff now, I sit down and I draw and I erase and I draw. This guy it flows like water out of the end of his fingertips. I've never seen anybody be able to create so much in so little time since. And
it's still been like that. On Age of Resistance, Brian would sit in his little office and just draw. As he finished one page, he'd hand it off to somebody who'd, copy it, and give it to the person that needed to use it. So every day, he'd just turn out loads and loads, and then he'd have a nap.
Yeah. Because I couldn't really be bothered. I was just so fed up. So I would just do something, just get rid of you.
Yeah. They probably still thought it was incredible, though, even just some simple doodle. Just off you go, run with that. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
No, I mean, I'm really quite touched by what you're saying, but it was interesting. I did a little bit of work on a project with George Lucas, and he said to me, I suppose you're wondering why I wanted to hire you, and I said, no. He said, well, I was impressed with, because he was one of our producers, wasn't he, on Labyrinth, and so that he was impressed with all the goblins, how all different the goblins all were, and that's what he wanted from me. So yeah.
Tim? How did you get on when you were kind of moving from Brian's very organic and asymmetrical style, bringing that into the 3D realm and constructing, sculpting?
I was supposed to be sculpting pod people. And I would take them to him after I would sculpt from his drawing. And he would say to me, Tim, they're supposed to be happy potato people. They're not supposed to be depressed. And I'd say, well, but Brian, one eye is up here, one eye is over here. And he said, yes, but they're supposed to be happy potato people, not depressed. He said, and then he said, go and do another one. So, and I would have like 20 to choose from on a sheet of paper. So I did another one, and I brought it back, and he said to me, no, this is not a happy character. He said, all right, we'll make yours slaves. And I turned out, like, I don't know how many slaves. I don't even remember how many.
I got to make some of the happy pod people.
I never had one that passed.
Wasn't in your personality, was it?
I know. At one point, he said, "Are you depressed?" Yeah. I said, "No, not at all." Okay.
One of the difficult things that has continued to be difficult is that Brian would give us sketches, but he'd only give us one angle. So he'd either give us something, a side view, or he'd give us a front view.
I refute that.
And, well...
I draw like Picasso.
Almost.
So there are several views in one plane.
There has never been a drawing of a mystic front on.
No.
Never.
So he was always surprised when we'd come up with something and go, but it doesn't look like that. He said, well, how would we know? We can't see what it looks like from around the other side.
Because there were countless, or many revisions of the Gelflings kind of going through there. The eye roll, yes. Lots of revisions.
It's amazing that they're married.
Yeah.
You saw how many Gelflings this woman produced. No. When I look back at the books now, I go, oh my gosh, it was like, how many?
At least I'm fast at
Hundreds.
sculptors. So, yeah.
Did any of those earlier designs, kind of inspiration from those, make their way elsewhere into the rest of your work, into the film?
No, well, there were only 2 Gelflings.
No,
in
yes,
the
but
film.
your early kind of design thoughts of your earlier
Oh.
Gelfling designs.
I don't think into Dark Crystal particularly. No, I mean, I've certainly used them because now I sculpt and I make figures and dolls, and everything I learned on Dark Crystal and used on Dark Crystal, I put into my own work as well. But no, well, we were just glad to finally get 2 that everybody kind of agreed on. That was
It's quite good. A few of them have been wiped out then, so you didn't have to design anymore, right?
And then on Age of Resistance, there are hundreds of them. You know, you think, oh my god.
Because the hardest thing was that Jim, when I did lots of designs, and again Wendy was sculpting all the time to try and please Jim, because Jim had a really clear idea in his head of what these things looked like. But he didn't have the ability to articulate to us verbally what he meant. Except all he would say, in this wonderfully splendid way, was it needed to be classical. So that was it. So our problem is, everything else is all gnarly and wrinkly, and you can get away with there's lots of personality in there. But once you get rid of that and you start to smooth it out, and you're depending on major shapes and forms, it's really tough. And that's what we hit against, wasn't it? Because at one stage...
Because they had to be heroes, and he wanted them to be heroes. And that was another thing that... they either were too sweet or too weird looking or too something, and until they finally... And then also Frank would have a say, Frank Oz, and so did Gary Kurtz, and so did Brian. So it was interesting to have 4 people walk through on the same day going, oh, I like that. And they'd be, no, I know. Well, I like part of this one, and I like this.
So how did you keep calm? Did you kind of exert your creative control over other things to kind of channel, like therapy, this creature's mine, I can do what I like to it type of thing? Or
some of the little forest creatures. No, actually, the whole process was a wonderful learning experience, and it was fun. It was hard work, but it was all interesting. It really was. And we had the luxury of time. So we got to spend time figuring out how something would look, how it would move, without having to think, oh, I've only got 3 days to do this. And we were lucky, very lucky.
5 years. I worked on it for 5 years, day in and day out. The thing, what happened is, which was in the end a gift, is that Jim really wanted to make the film, but other people didn't necessarily. But also, because of the success of the Muppets, when he got the deals that they wanted more Muppet movies, So that came in ahead of us, but it just gave us more time. I'm glad it took us that long, because we were, trying to figure things out. Lots of string and gaffer tape and bicycle cables, and it was all just like cobbled together. But we were pioneering the technology, and so what was it? Meanwhile, going on, of course, was Yoda.
Yeah,
and that was Wendy. So that was. Yeah, but that was us, giving our expertise to them to really figure out if we were getting it right in terms of the technology of doing it.
Just touching lightly on Age of Resistance then, it's a good comparison, because the schedule for that was a lot shorter. You obviously had a lot of the experience and expertise behind you with that. Was it quite a different process though?
It started out being different because the new people working on it, none of them had worked on the original one to begin with, and they all figured, because almost 40 years had passed, it would just automatically be easier, and that the technology we had learned from would make the whole process easier. And then they found that, to be honest, hand puppets are hand puppets. You've still got to put something, something goes on your hand. It has to fit. Still has to move the same way. So it was quite an experience for them to realize that the technology hadn't moved on too much, apart from the CG help for some of the faces, which was amazing.
Yeah.
And that helped so much. But yeah, it was a learning curve for them that was very steep.
You're like, I told you so.
Yeah, I know, we did feel like that.
I mean, the problem is that technology just gets in the way. There's no doubt about it. The closer you can get your creature is to the hand, because this is the secret, and that's why Kermit is so successful and Miss Piggy. It's because it's that close movement. I mean and that's why the Skeksis are just, I think, successful, because that's all it is. It's a weird shape on the end of a hand, and so that was our best technology.
Yeah.
And every time you put other stuff on it, it always breaks down and gets in the way. And so, indeed, we had to just remind people about the basics.
But they ended up doing an amazing job with the number of puppets in the Age of Resistance. It's incredible. I mean, we're so impressed with it.
No, it's stunning. Going back to basics then of sorts, Valerie, you're most responsible for the land striders and sculpting the land striders. They're quite imposing, actually, as beasts, as animals. Yet personally, I find them quite endearing, kind of cute almost.
Oh, they were.
What kind of features did you draw out? What was your process as you were creating those from Brian's artwork?
Well, Brian gave me the drawing first, and then I made a model, plasticine model, which survived right the way through, actually, because it went from the model into the, scaled up into the full-size things. But the real difficulty was the performers had to learn how to walk on all fours on 5-foot-high stilts. And the top of the back of the land strider was 9 foot high. And they were only supported by one wire, one supporting wire that went up to a crane. And they had to be featherweight, and as well as being incredibly strong. And the biggest... I actually got into one in the early stages, and I couldn't lift my legs. And so the guys who wore them trained for 8 months to be strong enough to be able to run, because they really did run, leap, all that stuff was for real, obviously. And so the biggest problem we had was I had with the... I'd modelled the whole shape of the thing onto a body mould, and I had to ask that, in the film business, the people who make moulds and cast from moulds are called plasterers, because it used to always be done in plaster. I had to ask the plasterers to cast what I'd modelled in the lightest possible way that was strong enough, and they kept being too heavy. And I just would send them back. And I say, I can't possibly use this. It's too heavy. So they do some more for me, and we experimented in what could be inside. And we used aluminium tube, and then we used carbon fibre with the aluminium tube. And but they always came back too heavy. And the plasterers were sort of tearing their hair, because I actually brought some scales into the workshop and I weighed them. And I wouldn't accept anything that was over a certain weight, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to run with them on the 5 foot length of weight on the end of your foot. But that was the biggest difficulty, and they recast them over and over again. And in the end, they were really fed up with me, and they threatened to have an exhibition of all the things that I'd rejected. But it had to be done, because there was no, you had to make it possible for the performers to work in these things, and it was a huge technical problem, and so they had to be supported inside by I had a stunt person advising me about the inner garment that they wore, and he told me how to make the fastenings out of a sort of sandwich of Velcro, which I was very nervous about because I didn't know if it would hold, but it did. It was a really clever system. And so they had these very carefully tailored inner garments. Then they had a skeleton which moved independently under the skin. And then we used, I think, plastizote. We cast the main shape in plastizote, which you will know as sort of yoga mats, a very light plastic material which you can heat form. So the main shape was heat formed in this plastizote. And then it was covered with a very thin skin of latex, because you can't paint on plastizote. So we used latex for the texture. And I'd previously, before I worked on Dark Crystal, I'd been working for Terry Gilliam on a few films, actually. And I'd made the Jabberwocky for him. And on that, it was Terry's idea, actually, but he wanted the Jabberwocky to be covered in, it had to look like raw, rotting flesh. And so it was Terry's idea. He wanted us to cast cow's innards, tripe. So we made great big moulds of cow's innards, plaster moulds, and then out of the cow's innards we took latex skins, which made this wonderful, wonderful texture. So ever after Jabberwocky, and I worked on many films where I made creature costumes, I always used this texture on everything I made, including the Landstrider. So all the texture on the back of the Landstrider is made from cow's innards, or cast in very, very thin latex skin. But it looks fabulous, and it takes paint really well.
Starting with John this time, we've had a glimpse of the future, absolutely, of Dark Crystal, The Age of Resistance. Fantastic piece of work. What are your hopes and your views on the future now, from this day, of what Dark Crystal can become?
I think probably just carrying on from what it did do, which was trigger a whole new genre of material sources, like Valerie was saying. You had to find all sorts of new ideas, new things, new materials, new ways of doing things, and new ways of thinking about it, and putting new characters in front of the camera. So I think there's kind of a backlash against CGI, because someone said earlier, I think it was talking to Rick Baker at one of these shows, and he said the producers now, they just go, can you just do it in CG? It's like, no, we have to actually go to a workshop and make something and make it work. So I think that's probably gone past the easy fix. But the sort of ethos at Dark Crystal is to actually do it practically, to make things. As Wendy said, I think, you've still got to have a puppet. It's still got to fit on someone. It's got to work. So it's real world. Yeah,
and keeping that tradition alive as well. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's bringing that back.
Valerie?
Yeah, I'd go beyond that, actually. I think it's, yes, we can make things, and we all need to be makers and interpreters, but it's what we're interpreting that I think is important. And I was really struck watching Dark Crystal recently at how current it was in the current sort of world. And I think we've become so materialistic in this world, and it is really, we're an endangered species, there's no doubt about it. And I think that Dark Crystal takes us back into into nature, into mysticism, into the other parts of the brain, which we really need to listen to, the imagination and creativity of nature first, and then as it gets passed down to us and how we can develop that and extend it. And this is what is sort of implicit in Dark Crystal. And that's where we need to sort of continue more.
The odd thing, I think, when we were making the original film, Jim was a very, indeed, you mentioned that, you're a spiritual person, and somehow his ambition was always to save the world somehow or another, and I think we still do it in everything we're doing. We're just trying to subtly, not beat people over the heads with it, but Jim really wanted people to get on with each other, and we certainly did as a team on the first film, and we did over the Netflix series. Everybody was, I think with Jim, he always treated you as an equal. I mean, it was really fascinating because Jim was a very tall man and I'm rather short, but I would walk down New York Street with him side by side and I felt as tall as him, and that's the way he treated you. The response that we had from the original film over the years, just talking to people, has always been a creative response. When people talk about it, they've always said, they don't want to get into movies or necessary, they want to write, they want to draw, they want to talk to people, always creative. And I think the new Netflix series is absolutely carrying on that tradition. And because in the original film, we used a lot of people that weren't in the movie business. They came from elsewhere. They came from different disciplines, and it shows up in the richness of visually of what you're seeing in it, but also it shows up in the richness of human personalities that shine through the artifice of puppetry. It's always somehow that Jim had this ability to allow us to create something that always was true.
I don't know if there's anything else to say after that. I mean, really, it is. We're so lucky to have worked on this and to have pioneered this kind of film, this kind of filmmaking, these kind of creatures, and the craftsmanship and skill that's gone into them, as well as the heart and soul that's gone into them. And we would just like to be able to carry on doing that ourselves and pass it on to people of, the younger generations to do it too. And just, celebrate the beauty of puppetry, really.
A couple of years ago, I did a seminar at Dragon Con in Atlanta. And Charlie Chiodo was sitting next to me. And he was talking about working on killer clowns from outer space and critters and all these other things. And he said, we were all doing fine. And then he looked at me and he said, and then you bastards made Dark Crystal. and I was like, what? I was like, and he said, no, you don't understand. He said, we had 3-month production time to make things and build things. And you guys came out with Dark Crystal, and every producer was saying, I want you to do this, and I want you to have it done in 3 months, and I want it to look like Dark Crystal. And we would go, you realize that Jim has a dedicated workshop there where those people work every day for years building that stuff, and you want it in 3 months, it's not going to happen. And he said, you really were the curse of the movie industry. And I had no idea, because I literally came out of college. I started working for Muppets right out of college. So I had no perspective. I was used to being, having that luxury. It was an incredible luxury to be able to work for weeks and weeks and weeks creating stuff.
Huge round of applause, please. Tim Clarke, Wendy Froud, Brian Froud, Valerie Charlton, John Coppinger. Thank you very much. Oh.